Hi everyone, I'm Jayatri, Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute. Joining you again this afternoon for our daily update on the COVID-19 disease that's a pandemic around the world these days, and really focusing in on some elements of the science behind it. In the US, we just hit over 100 deaths from the virus just in the last 24 hours. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about the biology behind the signs and symptoms that we see of the disease to help us understand why we see this whole range of symptoms from people who have no symptoms at all the way to those who are unfortunately dying after being infected. So one of the things that I wanted to get across first of all was just some of the most common signs and symptoms, which is a fever, a cough, most often a dry cough, and then fatigue and shortness of breath. These are the mild symptoms that the majority of patients experience. And for that level of symptoms, patients are generally encouraged to just stay at home, rest, and kind of get better on their own. But for a subsegment of the population, these symptoms can get more serious, most often developing into pneumonia. And as those symptoms get more serious, that's when people require hospitalization and more intensive care. So when you look at lab results from some of the patients who have been hospitalized, you see abnormal counts of white blood cells that are indicating, the immune system really going into overdrive, trying to fight off the infection. And as a physiological impact, we are seeing fluid building up in the lungs that are, again, another sign of where the infection is happening and what the body is doing to try and fight it off. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what happens when the virus gets into the body so we can start to think about the underlying mechanisms of these symptoms. Now, to understand what the virus is doing, we have to understand a little bit about how the virus is built. So the virus, imagine, is that kind of like a shell, where that outer shell is made up of fatty, oily lipid molecules. That's why soap can break it down. So imagine use soap to clean a dish or a pan after you've cooked with grease in it. Same way that soap can break down that grease. When you wash your hands, soap can break down that shell that's made out of these oily lipid molecules. Now, sticking out of that shell are these proteins that are called spike proteins because they're literally kind of look like spikes coming out of the structure of the virus. And then there are also other membrane proteins that are embedded into that shell. Now that shell then encloses the genetic material of the virus, which in this case is RNA. And that's important to know just because RNA changes faster than DNA does. And so that has some long-term impacts in terms of how the virus might evolve. But the most important thing to know here is, in terms of how the virus is interacting with the body, is those spike proteins that are sticking out of that outer shell. When the virus enters your body, those spike proteins end up binding to a protein called ACE2 that's present in your airway tissue. And this is like a lock and key mechanism. It's like, the ACE2 protein is an existing lock in our body. And this particular virus has evolved to become a key that fits into that lock. Now, what's really fascinating is that scientists have very, very rapidly been studying this interaction to the point where we actually have a picture down to the atomic level of how the virus and the spike proteins are actually interacting with that ACE2 protein in the body. And this is a pretty cool technique. They were able to discover this using a technique called cryo-electron microscopy, or cryo-EM, where you can essentially supercool biological molecules and image them through a very powerful microscope in their natural state. So we get a real-time understanding of how different proteins fit together at this very detailed level. And in fact, this particular technique has been so transformative to the study of biological structures that the Franklin Institute honored Dr. Joachim Frank, who invented this technique, with a Franklin Institute award back in 2014. So, it's a one that has really changed the way we're able to look at these molecular interactions. And hopefully down the line, understanding that interaction could help lead to drugs and stuff as well. But for our case, as we're trying to understand how the interaction is causing these symptoms, what's important to know is that binding of the spike protein with the ACE2 protein is kind of the first step in a cascade. So once those two proteins bind together, then that allows the virus to then fuse its shell with the outer membrane of the host cell. And once it's joined together, the RNA from the virus can then go into the host cell and essentially hijack the host cell's molecular machinery to allow it to start making more components of the virus, to make new copies of the virus, and also to kind of preemptively shut down the immune response. So as these new components are being created, they're then transported to the outside of the host cell. They're assembled into new copies of the virus, and out they go to the rest of the body. So once this infection happens, the RNA of the virus is encoded to take over the host cell and reproduce millions of new copies of the virus, which is how the infection can spread. So then getting back to the symptoms, as your body starts to detect this virus inside, your immune system starts to react. Now, what we know is that because the virus tends to come in through your eyes, your nose, and your mouth, again, this is why we're not supposed to touch our faces, that the infection tends to start in the upper respiratory tract. And when it's up here, it's a little easier to fight it off. So this is when a fever actually helps trigger some of the pathways in your immune response to then activate your body fighting back. And then the dry cough and the shortness of breath is coming as that immune reaction is happening in that upper respiratory system. Now, for most people who experience just these mild symptoms, the immune system basically does the job while the virus is still in that upper respiratory system. The problems come when the virus is able to then move down into the lungs. And this is when the virus has now been shown to actually damage cells called alveoli in your lungs. These are the cells that exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So they're critically important to maintaining oxygen levels for your body. Now, as your immune response starts to develop even further, and it kind of goes into overdrive, you often see buildup of fluid and immune cells building up in your lungs. This ends up thickening the lining in your airways, which makes it harder to breathe. And so you end up with your body just not getting enough oxygen. This is why patients need to go on ventilators, and things can become very critical. So that kind of helps us understand the range of symptoms. Now, one thing that we do know is that more often people who have underlying health conditions are more susceptible to these more serious symptoms of the disease. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the interactions between these other health conditions and the COVID virus. So as we've been talking about some of the impacts of the virus on the lungs, it's not hard to imagine how patients with other chronic respiratory conditions, think cystic fibrosis or COPD, who already have compromised lung function. This is kind of a double whammy that's coming in on top of that compromised ability to breathe already. Another condition that seems to make people more vulnerable is diabetes. And so far, the evidence seems to show that for patients who are managing their diabetes well, they don't seem to be at a greater risk than others. But for those who may have high levels of blood sugar, that's a condition that is already eliciting an inflammatory response in your body. So when the virus comes in and that immune response then causes even more inflammation, again, you're seeing those effects compounded on each other. And the third one that seems to have a really high risk factor is cardiovascular disease. And we don't really understand the relationship yet. There's some hypotheses out there that because cardiovascular disease affects other related ACE proteins in the body, so you may have heard of drugs called ACE inhibitors that are prescribed to people with cardiovascular disease, that there might be some kind of interaction there. We just don't have any data one way or the other yet. And certainly doctors are still recommending that if you take those kinds of drugs, you should continue taking them and talk to your doctor. But maybe it could just be more of a systemic effect that, as you're having a harder time breathing, that puts extra pressure on your heart to function as well. And then that systemic effect might be what's creating this extra risk for patients with cardiovascular disease. I want to close our discussion today going back to the opposite extreme, which is the fact that we see many, many people, especially young people, who may have no symptoms at all. And this is because younger people tend to have more effective immune responses, that it may be catching that virus and getting it out of the system before you ever even see those symptoms in that upper respiratory tract. And so hopefully understanding the biology of that can help people understand what might be going on in their own bodies and why any of us may be carrying this virus around. So my hope is that as we understand more and more about the biology and that people understand the impact that it has on our own bodies, we know that just because we're not seeing any symptoms doesn't mean that we're not carrying the disease. And we do need to look out for our friends and family and neighbors who are at risk with these other health conditions and make sure that we're socially isolating ourselves to keep them safe. Thanks again for joining us today. I'll be back again tomorrow at 3 o'clock with another update on where we stand with COVID-19. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks.